Hey Prime members, are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
Thumbtack presents the ins and outs of caring for your home. Out. Uncertainty. Self-doubt. Stressing about not knowing where to start. In. Plans and guides that make it easy to get home projects done. Out. Word art. Sorry, live, laugh, lovers. In. Knowing what to do, when to do it, and who to hire. Start caring for your home with confidence. Download Thumbtack today.
Super real.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans, and you're listening to What It Was Like, the show that asks people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. Hey, welcome. It was around this time, 80 years ago, that the Third Reich came to an end. In the opening months of 1945, Germany's cities lay in ruins after the Allies had pioneered carpet bombing. Meanwhile, advancing on Berlin from the east were the Soviets, and from the west, the Allies, the Americans, the Brits, and the French. And as these forces converged, they uncovered the full industrial horror of the Holocaust. The concentration camps, the forced labor camps, and across Poland, the death camps. The places that were designed solely for extermination. Places like Treblinka and Auschwitz, these were used to carry out the systematic mass murder of Hitler's undesirables. On January 27, 1945, the Soviet army reached Auschwitz. And until then, rumors of mass killings had circulated. There'd been reports, some journalists had done some pretty in-depth articles, but they still had an air of being just rumors. But that changed between January and April 1945, as these armies, they were coming in from the east and west, as I said, and they were just boys, really, young boys. They started stumbling upon these horrible places. And the Germans, they knew what they'd done was indefensible. In the final days of the war, they'd tried to destroy all of this infrastructure that they'd built. They blew up their gas chambers and they burned records, but still, the truth emerged. And I actually lived in Berlin just for a year in my early 20s, and I worked there as a tour guide. And I used to lead visits to Sachsenhausen, which is a former concentration camp to the city's north. So this is a subject that I feel pretty well versed in. And I've always wanted to do a Nazi story. I think, like a lot of people, I find the history fascinating. But on this podcast, I also like to do sort of modern takes on history. And I feel like the story of Nazis, it's just so well trodden that for the longest time, I was struggling to find a fresh message. I just felt like, I don't know, what could I offer aside from just raw horror? Also, the other thing that I was struggling with was finding a guest. And that's really just because the world is running out of Holocaust survivors. The ones that are left, they're all in their 90s. They're pushing 100. So first-hand accounts of the Holocaust, they're getting pretty thin on the ground. So I tried looking at some of the younger generations, and that's what brought me to today's guest, Julie Lindahl. Julie is the granddaughter of a Nazi SS officer. But what makes her story unique is the way that she's so willing to confront her family's history and her own sense of identity based on actual evidence. I think us humans, we all like to think that we're good. And when we're being bad, we sort of end up thinking that it must be justified. As an example, on this show, I've done multiple stories on serial killers, and they all seem to feel misunderstood. Or I've also done lots of cult stories. Several of these cults, they've led their congregations into mass suicides, and it's always to escape some kind of imagined persecution. And then when I look around, I see whole nations telling themselves these same kind of nonsense stories. I mean, for example, the Nazis, they saw themselves as victims of the Treaty of Versailles, as well as victims of just some sort of Zionist plot to take over the world or something. And my point is that humans, we generally believe that we're innocent, that we're good. And if we just happen to be doing things that aren't good and they're not innocent, that it's because either A, we're victims, or B, it was actually something that our grandparents did. We didn't do it. It was our grandparents, and therefore it wasn't us, and it's just better to just forget and just move on. But Julie, she doesn't do any of this. When she suspected that her family's story had a few holes, she went on a mission to find the truth. And her discoveries show us why honest self-reflection, why it matters, why reckoning with the truth of the past can be healing. And not just collectively, but personally. So this is a pretty thoughtful and I think at times somber conversation, but I think the subject matter demands some depth. So without further ado, I bring you Julie Lindahl. Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy that you're here. So you grew up in Brazil, but as we're going to discuss today, your ancestry is German. Tell me about your upbringing. How did your family end up in Brazil?
Yeah. Well, I only spent the first 4 years of my life in Brazil, which is connected to my dad's work. He was a banker working for an international bank, and because he didn't want to live at the headquarters in New York City, which was his origins. Okay. But the first 4 years of my life were in Brazil because of his work. Yeah. Okay.
And your grandparents, your Oma and Opa, they lived in Brazil as well.
Yeah. Right. Well, I also had a mother, as all people do, and she was German, and so they had left Germany for Brazil in December 1960, and so my parents met in São Paulo, actually.
Okay, great. And I understand that your grandfather, he died when you were 9 years old. Is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, but you knew him as a child. I'm wondering, what are some of your early memories of him? What impression did you have of him when you were a kid?
What I would say is that I don't have any strong memories of him. I mean, my grandparents came to visit us from this place where they were living in the interior occasionally, not often. Then we can discuss this to whether they really wanted to show themselves that often. So they came to visit us occasionally, and what I think I can remember, the sensual memory is struggling to pull off a dirndl, which is a German national dress that I seem to be always dressed in by my mother before they came, because I think my mother wanted to sort of make them proud and demonstrate that, she remembered our German heritage. And I do remember the itchiness of this. And whenever I start to share this story, I usually go back to that dress because I was, in some ways, from a very young age, clothed in history.
Okay, literally, you were wearing this very traditional, old school journal.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to disparage national dress. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I think the thing was that in my family, it was loaded. It was loaded with history that no one wanted to discuss openly and clearly and truthfully. And so therefore, I became this sort of, I suppose I felt the weight of that as everybody looked at me wearing this, and there are lots and lots of pictures of me wearing different ones. But I think this was more. I think it was an effort to show that, probably from my mother's side, a kind of loyalty to her parents.
Yeah. But it sounds to me like from even at a young age, you felt a tension there, that this effort on behalf of your mom was at odds with what else was happening in your life.
I think what I sensed, and as I was growing up, what I heard was a lot of tension and argument going on at family gatherings, and this did not get better. It got worse, or maybe I just tuned into it more. But I do think there were times when we could all be together, especially my mother's family, and when any mention of my grandfather came up, it was explosive material.
Yeah.
And it had the effect it had on me was that when the adults get angry, especially when your mom gets angry and irritable, is that you think you've done something terribly wrong. Yeah. So I started to feel very ashamed of myself because I thought that I had done something unspeakable that could not be discussed. And in my case, I watched the anger and the frustration and serious loss of temper, and thought, I've done something, and no one is telling me what it is. And that's what shame is. It's different from guilt. Guilt, you've done something and you feel bad about it. Yeah. Shame to me is something, you have a poor sense of self. Your sense of yourself is negative, but you don't know where it comes from. So it's like being in a dark room and just going around and not knowing where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you remember what the fights were about that you were overhearing?
Well, when I was young, very young, no. But as I got a little bit older, of course, I started to understand or notice that they were always somehow connected to my grandfather. And these arguments were shut down. It's not like there were extensive, coherent arguments around this. Tempers simply flew. People would leave the room. Someone would say, well, it was like this, it wasn't like that, big disagreements. Some wanted to defend him, others, said, no, it wasn't like that. And nobody wanted to discuss the facts, which I uncovered later on. No one wanted to discuss the actual facts. It was just, no, he wasn't like this. Yes, he was like that. No, it wasn't like this. Yes, it was like that. And of course, that goes on in families all the time.
Yeah.
But the level of intensity in this case was such that as a child, and I know my sister felt the same way, it was just unbearable. And the times when there were those kind of gatherings, the two of us would try to, for as long as I can remember, remove ourselves from the room and go sit somewhere else. And my sister, actually, when she was young, she became kind of rebellious as a result of this. Drew in black charcoal all over her face how much she hated this situation because it was so intense. And I think both of us, as time went on, became physically and psychologically ill. We were deeply, deeply affected by this situation, which became a motive for me later on to start to look into it.
Okay. Well, let's move a little further down the timeline here. So I understand in your 20s, you started to talk with your grandmother, not really directly. You just sort of dip your toes into this sort of forbidden subject matter and see how she responded. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I was in my early 20s. And I visited my grandmother quite often on my own, I would say from my late teens to my early 20s, because I got a Fulbright scholarship to study in Germany, so I could go and see her. And then I was studying, actually, I chose to study Polish-German relations in the 20th century. There are no coincidences.
No, it does not sound coincidental.
When I was at Oxford. And I didn't choose it with my family in mind. I just was drawn to the topic and Nazi Germany and, Poland in the Second World War. So she was a very, she was a sophisticated person. And she was also an oddly modern person for somebody who'd been born in 1912. She had very modern ideas about women and what women should be allowed to do and all that.
Okay.
So I felt, happy visiting her, but there were certain moments when it was as if she just simply wasn't herself anymore. There was even her voice changed. So it was like some very frightening voice from the past would just take her over. And she would start spouting ideology, which she felt it was quite important for me to take in. And the centerpiece of this ideology had to do with the Holocaust, which was that, the Holocaust, what she tried to drill me with was that the Holocaust was essentially a lie or an exaggeration by the international media to keep Germans down. And she'd always lower her head like this. The whole world is against Germany. And of course, she grew up in a world, in a post-Versailles or pre- and post-Versailles world. Those were her formative years, where the world was trying to keep Germany down.
Yeah.
And this had kind of stuck with her. And this was, as for many Germans in her generation, her interpretation of what went on. Now, I think somewhere deep inside, she knew pretty well the Holocaust had happened because she was stationed in occupied Poland during the war. So she wasn't like one of the usual situation for the women, which is that they stayed at home in the West, in the Old Reich. She was there.
She had front row seats.
She had a front row seat. And, even though the camps, not anyone could go into the camps, it was very clear that Jews were being deported left, right, and center, and that they vanished. And,
they vanished. That's right.
And it became common knowledge that they were being murdered pretty early on. So, but she, on those occasions when she would try to convince me that either it didn't happen or it was exaggerated, I would just cower because, it just went like this because I thought, what am I going to say? This is an old woman who, she hasn't lost her mind, but she's just saying stupid stuff. And I would usually go and do the dishes or something like that. But in all the years since then, or even at that time, I can tell you that I learned how awful it is to be a bystander. I learned what it means to be a bystander because especially when I was at university, I knew all the facts.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like I bought any of what she said. I knew exactly. But I didn't say to her, well, Grandma, that's not true. Why didn't I do that? I didn't challenge her.
Why?
Yes, I didn't, because at the time I was so desperate for her love.
Right.
And I sensed that if I challenged her on such a point, this was an issue that was so important to her for me to register, that I would lose her love and respect. And actually later on, I did. Much later on, which we can talk about. But so it's I'm not defending myself in any way. Clearly, I should have said something, but I think you have to have a context for. The study of history we can condemn people for a lot of things in the past, but once you get down into the details, and you start to understand the context in which they're operating, you start to say, well, that was wrong, but I get how it could happen.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's plow forward. Up until this point in your 20s, what was the story that you'd been told about your grandparents' lives? Like, what did you understand about your grandfather?
Yeah, I had been told very little. Even the mention of him or questions about how his name was spelt was, ignited created a terrible situation. So you can imagine that with that, I didn't ask very many questions about him.
Yeah, you got the signal.
I got the signal, and I didn't learn very much about him. Over time, the person from whom if there's anyone who I learned anything from, it was my grandmother, because she told a lot of stories. Her portrayal of him and their situation, particularly during the 30s and the war years, was that they were victims. They were the victims.
In what way?
Well, they were, first of all, Versailles lurked everywhere in her portrayal of the situation. That Germany was being ganged up on, that Germany had the right to resort to seek resources elsewhere. The other thing was not only it was also that they made it so much better. The places that they went and occupied, in fact, she didn't use that language, but where they set themselves up on various estates in occupied Poland. So my grandfather was an agriculturalist. He was an estate manager. He was a very good farmer, in fact. And so he was posted out there to convert, to make Poland the breadbasket of the Third Reich, because if there was anything that Hitler was very concerned about, it was that Germans back home would starve as they did during the First World War, starve to death. So what would come out in these conversations with my grandmother was, well, we made it so good, life was so beautiful, and then they tossed us out, and we were so badly treated, and we had to, was so hard. Life was so hard when we had to leave, and of course it was hard. She was pregnant when they left just before the Russians marched in, and she was pregnant with her 5th child. In midwinter in January, racing out of there with your 4 children, one on the way, to Berlin, which essentially is completely bombed out and flattened.
That's desperate.
So it was very desperate. Then there is the question of whether you should be portraying yourself as a victim. So that becomes very complicated, as we all know. Yeah. Because they were the invaders. They didn't see themselves as invaders. In their perception, they were taking back what was theirs. But the way they treated people, and it was a violation of international law. I mean, but she talked a lot about their time in the East. She never mentioned what role they were actually playing beyond that they had these estates.
Right. They were just farmers. They were there to cultivate the soil and...
just doing good things, good stuff.
Yeah, just doing good stuff.
Making things better. It was dirty, dilapidated, worthless, useless Poles went off on holiday in the Riviera and did nothing to take care of their own country, which is, of course, nonsense. Most Poles were extremely poor and had no idea where the Riviera was. So that was the sort of thing. And it was... I always take with me her line, it was a beautiful life. And when I reflect on what I learned later on, I thought to myself, how many lives did it cost for you to have a beautiful life?
Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hey, Prime members, are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Serve up something special with the exceptional flavor of Omaha Steaks, America's original butcher. With 5 generations of expertise, every bite is 100% guaranteed to deliver the world's best steak experience. And right now, you'll save 50% site-wide during their semi-annual sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get an extra $30 off with code HOLIDAY at checkout. This sale only happens twice a year, so shop now to save 50% site-wide on legendary steaks, premium chicken, beefy burgers, and so much more. All Omaha Steaks are hand-carved by master butchers, aged to perfection to maximize tenderness, and backed by a 100% guarantee that you'll love every bite. Don't wait. Shop now to save 50% site-wide on steaks and more during the semi-annual sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get an extra $30 off with code HOLIDAY at checkout. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with code HOLIDAY. Minimum purchase may apply.
So, at a certain point, you decided that you needed to know more. Was there a catalyst to going to Berlin, to digging into the archives, to look up your grandparents' history?
Yes, certainly. It was my father's passing, because he was, in some ways, a sort of barrier. You know, he tried to keep the past away. And he had told me when I was at university, he when I asked him the question of what my grandfather had been up to during the war, he forbade me from ever asking questions about it again.
What did he say? Could you give me a sense of the gravity of that moment?
Yeah, I mean, he was very shaken by my question. And my father was a very gentle man, so it was very alarming to see him so angry. I mean, I just asked a simple question, and it was logical because I was studying that history at university, and he was visiting me. And I just said, you know, what was his role during the war? Was he one of the perpetrators? And my father just started shaking and got very upset and said, you know, you may never ask those questions again, never ask anything like that again. And just seeing my father looking like that made me so sad that I thought, I have to put this away, which I did for well over 20 years, until he got cancer and we knew that he wasn't going to make it. He actually asked me to make him a promise when he was dying. He said, you know, look after my grandchildren. And of course I will look after my children. But it was the way he said it that made me think, well, if I'm going to look after your grandchildren properly, then I'm going to have to break my old promise to you, which is to never look into the past. To look after them, to look after your grandchildren, are going to have to figure out what happened. I didn't say that to him, but I thought it. And after his passing, I didn't start to look into it straight away, but I went to a very deep depression, very deep personal crisis. Wasn't able to get out of bed in the mornings at all. And I had a family to look after and work to do, and my husband said, "So, do you need help? Do you need do you need to go talk to a professional or?" And I said, "No, I need to go to the German National Archives, the Bundesarchiv," and he was very supportive of me. My husband is a very insightful person and probably wise because he's a bit older and quite a bit older than I am and has seen a lot of life, and said, "You go do that and I'll look after the children."
That's
so
nice.
That's where it started.
Okay, wow. All right, so take me to Berlin. What happened?
Well, very foolishly, I just turned up, which is really not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to book if you have to make it, write to them and ask whether they have any documents. And actually, it's not easy to get documentation on your family from this time. You need to have permission from family members from earlier generations, and there's a whole rigmarole you have to go through before you can look at anything. But it may have been fortunate that I didn't go through all that and that I was very naive. I knew how to research because I was trained, but I was in such a state of desperation that I didn't think about booking in advance or contacting them.
Yeah.
So I turned up with my little suitcase and was walking down the road and happened to run into a journalist on my way who just happened to be, as it turned out, an extremely important figure who saw to it that the Eichmann documents were released to the public and also had interviewed the last living Nazis in Argentina.
Wow.
So it was just a coincidence. And she said, "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm going to go see if there's anything about my grandfather in the archives." And she said, "Oh, that's very important," and very supportive person. Because very often the response to my saying anything like that was, "Why are you doing that? Why didn't you just let past be past? It's just such a waste of your time. Look to the future."
Is that what your friends and family were saying?
I would say the majority. Well, my family didn't know what I was doing, except my sister. And if they had, they would have done everything to stop me.
Right.
So it was only my sister who knew, and she was in such a state that she was in very poor mental health, and I just felt like I have to do something. So, it was fortunate that I met this attitude as I was going to the archives from this journalist who was urging me on and saying, "This is important, go for it. I will wait for you outside with a cup of coffee when you come out." So I went in and, just asked a simple question. And all I can say is that I must have looked so distressed, in such a state of meltdown, that a very kind archivist stepped forward and said, "Well, I'm going to help you here. Actually, it's sort of a borderline case, but I'm going to help you. You just can't release the documents to the public," which I have never done. And he came up with, immediately he sat down, he said, "If I find anything," which really wasn't very likely because, the Nazis were good at destroying their own documents. The Allies were good at bombing Berlin, and other places. So a lot of documentation was destroyed. So the likelihood that I was going to find anything was very small.
Okay.
But immediately he called it up. He said, "Could this be him? We've got about 100 pages." And I said, "Yep, that's him."
And was this on a computer database? So what am I picturing
It's on a
here?
computer database. And it's just his name came up. Wow. So he went and got the documents, and I sat down and looked at them, and he was with me because, it's one thing to get this documentation, but it's another thing to be able to interpret it.
Yes.
Because this is documentation from the Third Reich, the time of the Third Reich, the language.
Dense and like high German, pretty bureaucratic and official and, hard.
Yeah, a lot of administrative stuff
Yeah.
as well, which, I have no idea what it's. It's not that I had no idea, but you have to know where to look, and you need a trained eye.
Got it.
To be able to interpret what the document is in fact telling you. And so he interpreted a bit for me, and I said, "You mean he was SS?" And the archivist said, "Without a shadow of a doubt."
Wow.
And
this was the first time that you'd ever suspected that your grandfather was in the SS?
No, it's not the first time, but to have it said to you like that,
like definitively,
makes it very clear.
Yeah.
As I was looking at these documents, I had a strange thing happened in my head, which is probably a defensive reaction, which was denial. I did not want to, even though there were photographs of both my grandfather and my grandmother. So I recognized the woman in the pictures. This was my beloved. I recognized her handwriting in the official papers because I'd received birthday cards and Christmas cards from her during my entire life,
Wow.
So it was, but I at first I just sat there and said, this is not them. This cannot be them. And then it was her handwriting that eventually convinced me that it was them. But there's a strange mental thing that goes on, which, even in a situation like that, our human psyche is so drawn to denying atrocities and bad news that's close but in any way connected to us. I'm just saying, think about the fact that there's a lot of people who lightly deny the Holocaust today. I was sitting in front of the documents and looking at very clear, unequivocal evidence, and I sat there and thought, nope, no. But I of course, I accepted it eventually, and then the guy was going to send me a coffee, and so I went outside, and the journalist was sitting there next to the coffee machine in the locker room, and she said, "So what'd you find?" And I just looked at her and said, "Well," so I unloaded the basics, and she said, "What are you going to do now then?" And then I said, "Well, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know." And my instinct was, I called my husband, and I was in total shock, and he was in total shock. And I said to her, I said to myself, actually, no, I think, this is enough. I know enough now, and I'll just. Now I know, and that's enough, and I'll just put it away. And I think a lot of people who knew me would say, there was even a woman I knew as a Holocaust survivor who was the last person I saw before I actually made the trip to Berlin. I went to visit an old friend of mine in Germany who was a Holocaust survivor, and I told her what I was doing, and she said, "Don't go there. Don't go there." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because I don't want you to get hurt." Because she had known me for a long time, and she was absolutely convinced that this was, I was going to find something very difficult to deal with. So the journalist, anyway, there in the locker room, she looked at me, and she had these sort of dark-rimmed glasses that I'll never forget. And she looked at me through these dark-rimmed glasses, and she said, "You have been given very important information. You are trained to research this. You have a duty to pursue this as far as you can, and I will help you in the beginning, just to get going." Well, had she not intervened with that at that time, most likely I would have put it away. And some people would argue that that would have been best. In hindsight, I can say that I don't think it would have been best. It would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been the best thing to do. It wouldn't have been the right thing to do.
Yeah, right. Okay. So in some ways, she turned you onto this journey. Like it sort of started with this kernel, a couple of documents, well, a lot of documents, and she was the one who went, no, further. You've got to go further.
Yeah.
So what were the next few steps on this journey?
Well, as you can imagine, I didn't have it all clearly laid out. I didn't think, okay, now step 2 and step 3. I'm a trained historical researcher, so I went back and I sat in my study and I looked at my bookshelves because I had documentation which revealed to me that my grandfather joined the Nazi Party in 1931 before the takeover of power, which suggested that he was a convinced Nazi, not somebody who joined out of convenience later on.
He's an early adopter. He was keen.
He was keen, and he was very convinced by one of Hitler's policy platforms, which was Lebensraum, or space for living in the East. So, and because he was hungry for land. He also wasn't particularly. He was anti-Semitic, like lots of other people at that time. Well, even today, as we've sadly discovered, lots of people are anti-Semitic, but he was. Anyway, and I also learned that he joined the SS also early in 1934. He was a very good rider, and so he joined the Mounted SS. Some people say that you were simply forced into that if you were a member of a riders association. It's true and not true. Okay. So, So anyway, the point was he was an early convinced SS man who then, when the war broke out, essentially at the outbreak of the war, he went into occupied Poland, and was part of the early, extremely violent phase of the war, which really set the tone of the war. And then my grandmother and the children, well, at that time she had 3 children, all came along in the spring of 1940, and he then was given this task in the autumn of 1939. He was called a special Führer for landed estates in East Prussia and Poland. So that was essentially, tasked him with making the land productive for the Reich, food production. But there was another task that he had as an SS man, and that was to wage a race war, a racial war. And he took that very seriously. And from there, I was actually able to proceed and make contact with archives in the Polish National Archives, and received more documentation. The paper trail was very long. So the documents that I found in Berlin were the beginning. And in the archives in Western Poland, I was given another big pile of papers, which included devastating testimonies, which were recorded in 1946, immediately after the war, from people who were forced laborers on his estates. So he was stationed at different places throughout the duration of the war, in charge of different estates. I think it's important also what I learned about his role on the estates was that these special Sonderführers, special leaders, special Führers. They were. There was actually a law or directive that was passed by Himmler, which basically said you as an estate manager, as a special Führer of landed estates, are the law on your estate. You are the law. So you decide how to handle things. No one is going to come and punish you for doing what you have to do.
A license to commit atrocities.
Yes. And so he really, in his perspective, did what he had to do. But there was in the testimonies, you could see that there was just gratuitous cruelty going on, completely unnecessary cruelty. And I learned more about what this cruelty was when a young historian, once again, another archivist, saw in my face how devastated I was. This time I was a Polish archivist. He was a historian. He said, what are you going to do with this information? And I said, well, I'm just going to go out into the Polish countryside and see what I find, which is ridiculous because I don't speak Polish. And he said, there are very few cases like yours that come up. Yours is a very special case. Let me call my wife and ask her if I can be freed from my child caring responsibilities this weekend, and I'll go with you.
Okay.
So we set out together. He was a wonderful person who accompanied me and was actually sat next to me in the car and held these testimonies in his hands and looked at the names of the family names of the people who had given these testimonies. And there were quite a lot of testimonies.
And just to be clear, these testimonies, so at the end of the war, 1946, local families in Poland were invited to testify against your grandfather about the sort of the stuff that he'd been up to while he was there. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was a process that was going on all over Poland, that they were, at that time, Germans who had committed crimes in the East were being deported to Poland, and without question, without exception, they were hung.
Yeah.
And I mean, he wasn't. I wouldn't say that he was. He wasn't a very senior SS man, but on the estates that he governed over, he was the law, and it was very clear that he had an impact on people in very considerable local areas. And this was borne out later on when this young historian actually tracked down 5 families in which there were eyewitnesses who remembered exactly who he was and his name, which is very says a lot given how many decades later this is.
Yeah.
It's a very long time ago.
Yes, he'd made an impact. He was memorable.
And think of all of the terrible times these people went through after that, with the Soviets coming in, and it was a horrible experience.
Yeah.
So these people have been through a lot of things in life, terrible things, and yet they remember this person from when they were either children or youth.
Can you give me one or two of some of the more sort of poignant interactions that you had?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite different reactions from the different eyewitnesses. So, as an example, one guy whose father had been beaten until he was unconscious and nearly dead, and who had personally been beaten by my grandfather, just looked at me. He was very sick also himself, just looked at me as though I was, awful. And my only goal was to just shake his hand when I left. The young historian who was with me, who was translating, said, there's no point in taking this any further because he's very distressed. And I said, I just want to shake his hand. And when I shook his hand, he was so bewildered. It confused him completely because I think he had his mind, and I'm not blaming him at all for this, wanted to put me in a certain category, and I was moving out of that category by trying to show compassion and friendliness.
Yeah.
So it confused him. But then there was just on the other end of the spectrum, there was a very important meeting with a man who also lived out in the countryside. None of these people had any wealth or money to speak of. They were all fairly poor, I think, by our standards. Though this guy had a reasonable house and a cherry tree orchard and a little garden and things. So they made it nice with the resources they had. And he welcomed me in. His wife and his grown daughter were there, and he said, "Now I'm going to share what really happened with you, and I'm going to tell you everything I can remember."
Wow.
And he was so friendly and so caring, and his daughter stood up at some point and put her hand on my shoulder because she could see how difficult it was to listen, because there were very unpleasant things that he shared. Not all,
Yeah.
but also very unpleasant things, and some things downright awful. And I realized at some point that this man had been beaten and still had on his body and his face the scars from that time when my grandfather beat him.
God.
Because he was a 10-year-old boy when my grandfather was the overlord on the estate where he and his parents were forced to work. And he forgot to remove his cap when my grandfather walked by, and so he was just bludgeoned for that.
Oh my God, what does it take to bludgeon a 10-year-old boy?
It takes a lot of hatred and a lot of propaganda.
Yeah.
And an enormous amount of brainwashing, and I would say a certain amount of derangement.
Well, I've got to ask.
Yeah.
So this man offered to tell you the sort of the complete unabridged story of what your grandfather did. Can you tell me?
Could I tell you what he did?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no, well, if I told you the whole story, it would take us several hours. But I think that because I listened to him for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours. I mean, I talked about this gratuitous violence. He liked to do that. He liked to trip up the laborers. So he didn't have any, there were no Jews there. They had already been deported, any Jews. And there were not that many Jews living in the countryside either.
Sure.
So my grandfather's violence was mainly against Polish laborers, poor Polish laborers.
Okay.
So Polish Catholics. He related instances where he would actually set up a trap so that, laborers would, for example, at one point he told some laborers to deliver some goods to a neighboring village and then set up some sort of trap by which the wagon that they were driving, collapsed, and so therefore he was able to go out and punish them, which was this constant beating all the time, to the point where people could not stand up. And he would force them, once he'd beaten them, to a pulp, force them to turn up to work on the following day. And if they didn't, then there would be more consequences. And at some point, at some point, there were a group of laborers who actually summoned the guts to approach him and say, we want to hold on to our homes because we understand we're going to be moved out of our homes, because that was the plan. Germans were going to be moved in. These people were just, regarded as, sort of detritus that were going to be just weakened, murdered, beaten to death, and, would eventually just disappear. And Germans they were also bringing in so-called ethnic Germans from the East, so German communities that had been living even as far into Russia as well, into Poland. So these guys, the guy who led this group was severely beaten for even asking the question. The other thing that I discovered, although this didn't come up in the conversation, was that he also became suspected of the murder of one of the previous Polish landowners, because for him to take over the estates, the previous landowners had to be removed. And either they were murdered or deported, or they managed to get away. But it's not confirmed, so I'm saying suspected murder. I'm not saying, but I was told by another archive I went to that, no, we didn't commit any murders. But then I said, there's something fishy here, because the pieces didn't all fit together. And so I dug a bit deeper and found the evidence that, in fact, he was a suspect for murder. So of one of the previous landowners. So, and we'll never know. It's never going to be, and so to listen to that for several hours was it was important, because I don't think that anyone had ever bothered to listen to this man's story, maybe once in 1946.
Yeah.
But I don't think that too many people were interested. I mean, he wasn't anyone famous. He was a, guy with not very many resources living out in the countryside. And so at the end, I just wanted to fall on my knees and beg him for forgiveness, because I felt I didn't set out to look for forgiveness, but I felt this feeling rose up in me that somebody from my family has to ask you for forgiveness, if that's even possible. And he didn't allow me to fall on my knees. He wasn't a very tall man, so he was smaller than me, but he was strong still, even though he was in his mid-80s. And he kind of just grabbed my forearms and held me up and said, he looked me right in the eye with his scars on his face and said, it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything, which was an act of extraordinary generosity.
Yeah.
And then he insisted that we should go outside because I was very rattled, and we went outside, and he insisted that we stand there together. His wife was on one side and he was on the other, and they stood very close to me. And the point was that he wanted me to understand how much beauty there was in the world, and that he wanted me to experience that and not be stuck in this ugly place.
Yeah.
Which is, and that moment, that is a transformational moment, because the shame that I had carried with me for so long became something else. It became responsibility. It wasn't shame anymore, even though I feel some shame from time to time.
Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
This cold and flu season, Instacart is here to help deliver all of your sick day essentials. Whether you're in prevention mode and need vitamins, hand sanitizer, and that lemon tea your Nana swears by, or you're in healing mode and need medicine, soup, and a lot more tissues. Simply download the Instacart app and get sick day supplies that reinvigorate or relieve, delivered in as fast as 30 minutes. Plus, enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Excludes restaurant orders, service fees, and terms apply.
Hey, Prime members, are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts, included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free, or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
I understand after you'd kind of gone on this transformative journey that you went and spoke to your grandmother again, and you confronted her with what you'd learned. Can you walk me through that?
Well, I guess it was not at the very end of all the research I did, because that went on for years. I even went to Latin America and all that, which is in the book. But somewhere in the middle, when I felt that I knew enough, I had enough of the facts, and I'd been to Poland and I talked to these eyewitnesses, and there was no question anymore. I thought to myself that if there's anyone, or the first person I have to talk to, if I talk to anyone, aside from my sister who already knew what I was doing all along, it is my grandmother. It's her. And because we've had what I thought was a close relationship my whole life, but it wasn't based on the truth. And I also knew that my grandmother had suffered from depressions and nightmares, clinical depression and nightmares ever since the war. And it struck me that, why does it have to be this way? Why can't we just together, humbly and lovingly towards one another, as weird as that may sound, acknowledge what actually took place?
Yeah.
And maybe a loving environment is more likely to produce that humility and acceptance than somebody accusing you of doing something, because then you become defensive, right? So it sounds weird, and a lot of people might say, how could you do that with somebody who was so bad and lying and so on? But I genuinely believe that that's the way to get people to realize, to get them to change, or to want to change. So I went there with the intention of doing this, but the night before I was going to take this, take this up with her, I chickened out, and I called my husband, and I said, she's 100 years old. What's the point? She was, however, completely alert and clear in her head. So, she could have a very sophisticated conversation, no problem. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. I wouldn't even considered it.
Yeah.
My husband, once again, very wise, said, you know what? This is not about her. This is about you. If she dies and you don't take this up with her, you will always regret it.
Yeah. Because
you would have done the same thing to her as she did to you, which is lie. And so I thought, oh God, no, I can't do that. So the next day I went there, and I thought, you are going to create a compassionate space here for some change to happen. And so I just sat on a footstool, actually, she was sitting in one of her big armchairs, as she always did, and I sat in a footstool and held her hand, and I just said, Grandma, we really have to talk honestly about what happened, because I know.
What was her initial response? What did her body language tell you?
Well, her body language, she stiffened up, and she knew exactly what I meant. She stiffened up and looked at me in a very different way than she'd looked at me in the past, as though I were a stranger or the enemy or something like that, and then delivered a long lecture, which I think lasted for more than an hour, about basically defending what they did. And I remember that she said that the SS were the most beautiful men that walked the earth.
Yeesh.
Referring to their physical appearance, which is kind of nonsense, because there were all kinds of SS men who looked all kinds of ways.
It's
but the idea was this tall, Aryan.
Of course,
the Aryan concept came through, and I was just shocked, because this is proof that intelligence has nothing to do with being able to accept the truth. Nothing.
That's so interesting.
Because she was always a very intelligent person, and she was just as intelligent when I spoke with her then and listened to her. But what I think happens to people, and this is the only way I can really explain it, because I'll never really know what went on inside her head and her heart and all that, is that if she had admitted how awful it was, Because actually, I learned from the eyewitnesses that at some point she called an apothecary to treat these bludgeoned people. So there was something in her that said, yeah. So there was something in her that sympathized with them.
Sorry, just to be clear, she was going behind your grandfather's back to
Yes.
mop up the blood and the mess that he was creating.
Well, she didn't do it with her own hand, but she allowed for a Polish pharmacist, essentially, to come and treat them and give them medicine without him knowing, because otherwise he would have. I mean, he terrorized her too, right? So she was also his victim,
right? And
she was also sexually abused by him.
Okay.
So she was kind of, but I think that in a way there were different things going on there. I think a part of her was always terrorized by him because her memories of living with him were just constant terror. So I think it was almost as if he wasn't really dead, as if, if you have this reflex that you always have to look over your shoulder because someone's coming to just scream at you or abuse you in some way, then that might not so easily fade. It might become something that's inbuilt. And so she just towed the line, so to speak. But I think there's something else, which is that if you have, if you know that something's as monstrous as the Holocaust happened and you were a part of it, in any way connected to the cause of the Holocaust, then it becomes existentially just too threatening for you to accept, because you would just you cannot survive. You cannot psychologically survive it. It's just too monstrous to take to yourself. And she had, I think, come up, she probably believed what she was saying when she said it. But, people start to believe lies that they tell themselves over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's right.
It's very complex. I think what we learn from this is that we are very complex beings, and that's why we have to watch out and learn about history.
Oh, it's hard. It's hard. Admitting you're wrong, or admitting that you were misled, or like stepping outside of what you've always thought of yourself and true and right. That's so hard.
Yeah, or what you thought of your family, because I love my family. I really do, and like anyone else wants to have love their family and have good relationships, and one of the hardest things was to go around with the feeling that I was doing something against their wishes, which I was. I was going against their wishes. And I think that's what stops the majority of people who are thinking of looking into some sordid secret in the past in their family, whatever it may be, whether it's connected to a genocide or something else. You basically say, okay, I'm going to go through this process of listening to all this, which is very, very painful, and face it all. Unless you're prepared to do that, you can't make the transformation. And it's interesting that I've heard from some of my cousins who have said to me, I've always had difficulties communicating with my parent. And so I'm really interested in what you discovered, because I think it might be an explanation for why things have been the way they've been. We haven't been able to talk to each other, really, not necessarily about the past, but just talk to each other, because there has, it's kind of ingrained in everybody to not talk.
Yes.
And also not talk in a compassionate way to one another. It's more avoiding. How do we avoid this and that and the other? It's like walking on eggshells all the time.
Yeah.
To me, the most interesting example of this was that when I went to Latin America, and I learned that I had Paraguayan cousins.
Wow.
So I went there to see them, and they were waiting for me at the airport. And it was the strangest thing. I was sitting in the traffic with my Paraguayan cousin, Patty, in Asunción, and we barely knew each other. And tears started rolling down her face through her sunglasses. And she looked at me. They sort of knew that I had been publishing stuff about our family and kind of knew about the Nazi thing, but they didn't know any details or anything. And she just looked at me and she said, "Tell me what happened in our family." And I said, "What do you mean, Patty?" And she said, "Well, we've had something hanging over us all my life." Now, bear in mind, this is a woman who's in her early 30s, and I just haven't understood what it is. Maybe you can tell me. So this is someone I've never met in my life. We don't have any connection. We didn't know about each other. And yet we both knew each other because we had been affected by the same thing.
In the same way.
The same way. The same old story had carried on and hurt another generation, which I think is very important to take to oneself if you're in a family that is trying to hold down a secret that you believe is inconvenient or going to hurt people. It's actually probably the reverse, that people are being hurt every day because you're trying to hold it down.
And it's leaking and they can tell, but you won't talk about it, and that hurts.
Well, it's like poison.
Yeah, it's corrosive. I mean, what you're saying, I think, makes absolutely perfect sense on an individual level. But I think what's interesting is that your message applies equally to nations dealing with guilt. I mean, I think here in Australia, we had Australia Day just the other day, which is always this big culture war about, like, you know, the First Nations people of Australia were basically wiped out and we shouldn't celebrate that. And no, but it wasn't our fault. And, you know, it's always back and forth. It's the same with, like, the conversation over slavery in the US. These kinds of disputes are universal, really. And you have a unique dedication to understanding the past instead of just saying, "Let sleeping dogs lie," or there's no benefit in revisiting things that we aren't personally responsible for. So I just want to hear you sort of unpack why it's important on a wider scale, on a wider, broader level to do this.
Well, I think you could make many arguments for it. I mean, just the sheer monstrosity of what happened in Australia and in Europe in the middle of the last century, and in Cambodia, and what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, you just couldn't all these
right
genocides and mass murders.
Yeah.
You can just say the sheer monstrosity of them requires that we reflect on them. And Elie Wiesel had an interesting way of saying it, which was, to forget the dead would be to murder them a second time, which is a very heavy burden to carry. Right.
Yeah.
So there's that perspective of it's just the sheer monstrosity of the thing, and that we're committing it again. The monstrosity just gets committed over and over again every time we say, "Nah, I think we'll just let that be over there and just not think about that."
Yeah.
Or just say it didn't happen or whatever.
Yeah.
What have you. I think another thing is that, at least when it comes to the Holocaust, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Holocaust is the basis for our conception of modern human rights. So if we don't know about it, we have nothing. You, me, everybody, our families, all Australian citizens, all Swedish citizens, everybody in the world is just without an anchor.
Right. Yes.
No conception of human rights whatsoever. Now, there are some people who are trying to unmoor us. Quite a lot of people and very strong forces. And I think it's very important for us to double down. And how do we anchor ourselves? Well, we anchor ourselves by remembering these horrific episodes in our history. But I believe the lesson of all these years that I've spent on this is that we're just lying to ourselves if we think that those people over there have nothing to do with us or are different to us, and therefore we can abuse them or forget about them or kill them or take all their resources or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Because it's going to come back to hurt us. My family is the proof of the pudding.
Yes.
You know, it came back to hurt us over generations. And so denying this truth of the oneness of our humanity and our relationship to the planet is always going to result in disaster, either at a society level or at a family level. Doesn't matter.
Well said. Yeah. Let's bring it back down to the individual for a moment. And this is my last question. I want to know if you've got any advice for anyone who's listening to this, who has maybe sort of stumbled into their own family's dark past in any sort of way. Maybe it's domestic violence or a sort of sexual thing, or it's like, I don't know, lots of families have secrets. I'm wondering what advice you would offer for someone who's struggling to deal with that kind of past.
What I would say is ask yourself at least one question. What does taking responsibility mean? What does it mean? How does dealing with this secret or this issue in your family help you to take responsibility? Because there can be people who you might go dig up a secret, but then things might backfire on you because you haven't asked yourself that question. You might be doing it to take revenge on somebody, or see, I figured it out. I know.
Right.
That kind of thing. That doesn't lead anywhere. That's ego. And so the question is, how can I take responsibility by in my situation, and let that guide you. And I would also say that if you don't do these things alone. If I was going to make anything out of this and do anything good out of this, or find out anything meaningful, I had to lean on an awful lot of good people with decent values. And what happens in that process is that being together and acting together with people who share your values also increases the strength and power of that force in the world. So that's what I would say.
Well said. Well said. Julie, this has been such an interesting and enlightening and beautiful conversation. And thank you for sharing this story. It's been amazing.
Thanks for talking to me.
Today's episode was produced by Rachel Tuffery. It was mixed by Jimmy Saunders, who also did our theme music. Our cover art is by Naomi Lee Beveridge, and this whole thing has been a Super Ill production.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.